One of the most ruthless executions to have occurred in Europe was when the King of France went to the guillotine on the 21st of January 1793 in Paris. He was a man who had been found guilty of treason against his own people. But King Louis XVI did not die as a king. He had lost this title, and the monarchy was abolished in the previous September. However, he was not the only member of the royal family who was executed, as his wife Marie Antoinette was also executed, and the Queen lost her head on the same scaffold. Louis XVI's execution was very swift, and it was a historic moment in history. But what happened when the guillotine fell, and what did the subsequent exhumation of Louis XVI's remains tell us about his execution? Now, as a young man, Louis XVI came onto the throne at the age of 19, and when he inherited the French crown, it was struggling. The government owed a lot of money, and there was a growing anti-monarchist sentiment. But the king was not the most confident, and he wanted to be loved by his people. However, he tried his best to be a good king, but he did make many poor decisions and contributed to the economic issues in France. One of the biggest problems was that he supported the colonists during the American War of Independence, and he gave a lot of money to support them against the English. But the financial problems plunged the country into huge problems. The king himself was a huge spender, and he and his queen were spending a huge sum of cash whilst the French people were suffering heavily. They did not have enough money for food, and the price of bread rose sharply, and the king then assembled the Estates General, the National Assembly, and this represented the three estates and classes of the French people. This was the first time for 170 years that they had been gathered. However, to the French people, the king and queen were held in contempt, and they spent a large amount of money, and the queen then began to become a key figure of hatred across the land, as she spent a lot of money on furniture, decorations, and upgrades to her palaces, as well as jewellery. But Marie and Louis were having huge banquets whilst the people were starving on the streets. The French people then rose up against the monarchy, and the rebels stormed the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789, and protesters ransacked the royal prison, and they stole weapons and ammunition. This was an attack on the king's power. But then further events emerged across the nation. For example, a march on Versailles took place where an angry mob forced the royals to move, but the king was then arrested in the August of 1792, and he was held separately from his family. But the king was then forced to accept a new constitution, and the monarchy was abolished. The king was now a hostage of the revolutionaries, and he was seen as a dangerous man, as it was believed that another nation would save him. There was evidence found that he had been allegedly negotiating with Austria, and he was then, for this, brought to trial for treason. It was decided that he should be executed, and one single vote sentenced him to death. His execution was scheduled for the 21st of January 1793, and his death sentence was debatable, and it brought an end to 1,000 years of monarchy in France. But some considered it an act of horrific terror, and that France was heading down a dark path of public executions. On the morning of his execution, he was helped to dress, and he met with an Irish priest and heard his last confession. But he was then taken through the streets of Paris from the Temple prison, and it took over an hour for him to reach his guillotine and execution structure. At 10 o'clock, the carriage arrived at the Place de la Révolution, and on the back of it the king was helped down and onto the execution scaffold. On the scaffold stood the guillotine, and surrounding it was a number of guards, and drummers stood ready for the moment to drown the king out as he was about to speak. He was approached on the scaffold by the executioner, Samson, whose assistants tied the king's hands together. The collar of the king's shirt was removed, and he was then prepared finally for the gallows. The priest who witnessed his execution claimed, "The path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone. 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pont Tournant, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Louis XVI tried to make a speech on the scaffold, but the drum roll drowned him out and his speech was difficult to hear. The king was then strapped to the guillotine quickly, and he was slid under the blade, and the signal was then given for this to be released. The executioner gave his account of the execution, and he said, "Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution, and asked Sanson why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, 'My people, I die innocent.' Then turning towards his executioners, Louis XVI declared, 'Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French.' The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la nation! Vive la République!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another account of the execution claimed, the executioners numbered 4, 2 only performed the execution, the third stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold. The executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style as the Revolution had modified it, and 3-cornered hats with enormous tri-coloured cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sanson, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. It was obvious what the cause of the king's death was: execution upon the guillotine, the very execution method that he allowed into the nation. The guillotine allowed a very straight cut to take the head off of someone. However, the king's body was then transported to the church of the Madeleine, where it was buried. It was claimed that, arriving at the cemetery, I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead in pursuance of an executive order. The body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by one of earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tampered down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. But the body of Louis XVI was then dug up decades later. The search for his body in the Madeleine cemetery took longer than the search for his wife's body, Marie Antoinette. But 12 feet down, the body of Louis XVI was found, and there was a lot less of the remains to find than his wife's. The king's remains were in a bad way, and they had decayed to a significant amount. The remains confirmed that the king had lost his head on the guillotine, and his remains were found in a very bad way, and his head was found between his leg bones, which was stated when he was buried. The amount of quicklime placed on the body of the king following his death had led to the quick decay of his remains, but there have been some parts preserved. It was said that, on the 20th of January we proceeded, in pursuance of the king's commands, to the house of M. d'Estreclos, where we, the commissioners who had been present at the preceding operation, together with other personages whose right of office or the king's commands had assembled, witnessed the removal of the remains of their majesties into leaden coffins made for that purpose. In the presence of these noble and other personages, we broke the seals and opened the chests in which the remains had been deposited. Those of His Majesty were placed in a leaden coffin together with the pieces of lime and wood, and were then soldered down. Upon the lid was fastened a gold plate with the following inscription: Ist est le corps de Truha, très pursuant et très excellent prince, Louis XVI. It's clear that those people who buried the king wanted his bones wiped off of the face of the earth, but what remained would be later placed inside of a new coffin and was then buried inside the Basilia of St. Denis. But the execution of the king was a ruthless one, and the discovery of his remains confirmed that he had lost his head lying on the guillotine with the sharp blade then falling. Thank you for watching and the support. Please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.